Boa tarde, muito obrigado, Maria Clara. And I'll stop speaking Portuguese, not to embarrass. And we have a very nice lady who's, I thank you in advance for your translation. The title has changed a little bit. It's giving you a historical perspective, but really also talking about the global pandemic of antimicrobial resistant gonorrhea. I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the time I spent with USP colleagues, and we are working at trying to get some more data on gonorrhea and other STI resistance in São Paulo and other parts of Brazil. A lot of the slides have been with the helping hand of one of my colleagues, Gwenda Hughes from the Public Health England, and she'll have a separate talk at 4 o'clock if you're interested in surveillance and other mechanisms of monitoring resistance. So I don't know if you remember, on the 29th of March, 2008, what you were doing. I was in London, and I got hit by news, warned by colleagues who could not come to a meeting because they were dealing with this. The worst case of super gonorrhea was hitting UK. So it stopped everything, all the news stopped, and you can see all the different media coverage from the BBC that usually is not hyperbolic in their presentation to others who are more like the Sun. So we have the first Greek bloke that catches super gonorrhea, and of course it's a woman in Asia who's given it to him. So we'll come back to that, why we came to here. First, let's just remind ourselves that gonorrhea features as one of the most frequent curable STIs in the world. There's about 1 million STI a day acquired in the world, and gonorrhea is about 78 million in the year, and the majority of these STIs occur in poor countries of the South. But we travel globally, and a lot of importation and transportation of different pathogens, including STIs, happen, and that is supported by data from travelers. About 1/5 of travelers have sex with a new partner when they are traveling abroad, most of the time without using condoms. 1/4 of gonorrhea cases in Denmark, in the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, were imported cases. So there's definitely lots of transportation around the world. And you can see here that actually this double bug looks like this guy and his suitcase. So that's your gonorrhea for you. Gonorrhea, as you probably know, is one of the key pathogens that has resistance and one of the global threats identified by WHO and CDC as an urgent public health threat, as we are running out of antibiotics to treat it. And this is somehow my historical perspective and the only real perspective I will give you about the history. So from the 1930s and 40s, when antibiotics were discovered to treat, before this was heavy metal compounds that we used to treat STI. So not only you were suffering with the STI, you were suffering with the treatment of the STI. So you would remember well that you should not get an STI. Since then, we have invented antibiotics, and every single class of antibiotic has been thrown to gonorrhea. Sulfonamide, penicillin, tetracycline, ciprofloxacin, all the way. Every time, gonorrhea is managing to find ways of escaping treatment. So we are now coming to the status of Superberg, where we have no more treatment for that particular pathogen. And that really is the case in the UK, where this graph shows the number or the proportion of gonococcal isolates that are fully sensitive or becoming resistant to all the different classes. So we're talking about here the proportion that will not be responding to any of the antibiotic is actually increasing. This is the opposite of this line, if you want. There are more and more gonorrhea that will not respond to anything we have, or partially respond. Globally, there's a big effort made by WHO in recent years to tell us about the different antibiotics we use and their resistance status. I put here in yellow is the sort of threshold that WHO says above which you have to switch antibiotics. So above 5% threshold, we should abandon a particular class and move to the other one. And you can see already for ciprofloxacin, there is no country that provides data where there is any good activity of ciprofloxacin. So essentially, we are already doomed around the world for ciprofloxacin use. It really is high levels of resistance, 50% and above. So WHO decided around 2000 to change 2010 to change guidelines and push for the use of cefixime. That also very quickly, as a single-dose treatment, started to fail. So they had to take into consideration other strategies, and I'll come back to that. If we look at azithromycin, there's more evidence of still activity, and that's the reason why this drug has been chosen to be a treatment still. But there are parts of the world, and that includes Europe, part of Africa, in the continent here, Peru and Chile, have already problems with azithromycin resistance. Mostly in Asia. The problems often start indeed in Asia because there are a lot of gonorrhea cases, because there is a large population of young people in that part of the world. And there's a lot of travel to and back. Now, azithromycin has a way that it still can work. You can only have to increase the doses. But there's emerging of high-level resistance azithromycin in the UK. And again, these made the news in the UK, in the major newspaper, The Guardian. So there was an epidemic that started in 2014, and they used molecular sequencing to find out that it was in several cities simultaneously. It started not in London, but in Sheffield, and certainly not in a place where people were traveling back and forth from other places. So it looked quite strange, and it had very different clones were introduced, although they were the same. But they came at different places and slightly different times. They all carried 23S RNA mutation, and they were all initially from low-level resistance. So it's actually a problem with the dosing of the drug. And the epidemic was about a small one still, but 120 cases reported in the UK. Fortunately, they were all ceftriaxone sensitive, so could be treated with alternative drugs. So it looked like this was going to be contained in the UK, and they did not have to change the guidelines yet. Now, cephalosporins is our almost final line of treatment, and then there's great concern that it could be exhausted. Just the same, the yellow represents sensitive strains at less than 5%. And blue is also sensitive. But look at that, in Asia, we already have major problem of resistance of cephalosporins. And it did happen, of course. It spread from Japan, where it was one case of a sex worker with high-level resistance, to 3 cases in Europe among MSM, so different groups, not necessarily have connections with them. 4 cases again, isolated microepidemics in Australia and Japan, and then more cases around the world. So it really has taken about 6 or 7 years for it to go around the world and starting spreading. It's few numbers, but it's very worrying. So in summary, we already have high levels of, and these are the different sources of information. Eurogasp is the European surveillance system. The USA system, and Canada, Australia, China, Japan, Thailand, and then we'll talk about Brazil in a minute. But ciprofloxacin resistance is very high. It's no longer a choice of antibiotic. Azithromycin is already being threatened in places like China and Japan, so Asia. And ceftriaxone also is started to become threatened. It still is a usable drug in other parts of the world, as you can see. And so is cefixime. So WHO decided to change international guidelines and to move from monotherapy to dual therapy using ceftriaxone and azithromycin. The WHO CDC have a low-dose ceftriaxone. European guidelines have high-dose ceftriaxone and high-dose azithromycin. The aim is to delay the accumulation of resistance and extend the lifetime of this particular drug until we find new drugs. but it starts to fail. So the first case of failure with dural therapy was published in 2015, and it was from the UK. And then this case, the 29th of March 2018, came to the UK with a very complicated story. He was a heterosexual man with a female sexual contact in Thailand and a girlfriend in the UK. He was treated not really with a guideline, but what was believed to be working, like ceftriaxone, and then spectinomycin was given. And although he cured in the genital tract, he still had oropharyngeal culture positive strain, and this was resistant to ceftriaxone, azithromycin high levels, and most of the other antibiotics. And in real haste and panic, well then, and this is the results of the molecular works and spene-associated ceftriaxone resistance, only seen once in Japan. The patient was treated with ertapenem IV, and eventually the throat positive sample was eradicated. And the story is, of course, two stories. Is make sure you have all anatomical sites swabbed, even though people would not be, for example, having homosexual sex. So that was something that the sexual history has to find out, so swabbing multiple sites. And two, the throat is actually a sanctuary for multiplication. You need to have very good drugs that penetrate the pharyngeal tissues. So at the time it was thought that it would just be limited to that one case in the UK. But just a few weeks later, Australia started to declare another 2 isolates who were not connected to one another, and they were very similar to the UK isolate. So there is already the evidence of geographic dissemination. We do not know whether these people attended the same particular place in Thailand, but there is definitely a lack of information, surveillance information from that part of the world. So we are dealing now with extensively drug-resistant potential for gonorrhea. So the superbug is here. In Brazil, there was a very large effort for the first time, and I should congratulate my colleagues from the Brazilian government and Maria Luisa Bato, who coordinated the study, because they did really what was necessary in such a big country, a multi-centric study. And they enrolled 550 men with urethral discharge from 7 capital cities, and that included Sao Paulo. And they published their results, and you're probably aware, if you're in here, that what they really found is, as expected, tetracycline and penicillin have high levels of resistance in red or intermediate resistance, so they are not to be used. Ciprofloxacin, about 50% resistance. So really you have azithromycin at about just the threshold of 5%. But there is intermediate resistance. There was no demonstrable resistance in vitro for cephalosporin, but some work was done in Sweden in a reference lab and found there is about 7% of the swabs, of the positive cultures, were borderline resistant. Now, what the Brazilian Ministry of Health did was to stop using ciprofloxacin, which had been used in the syndromic management for many years, and switch to the use of azithromycin and ceftriaxone, like the WHO guidelines. But watch this space. There will be some emergence of resistance. And I think the Ministry of Health has understood that and will not just stay at one study, but organizing a system, and they're repeating the survey as we speak. They are doing again, just to make sure that we have no problem with azithromycin resistance emerging. So in summary, the situation is azithromycin is very quickly selected resistance, and it's increasing worldwide. High-level azithromycin resistance occurs in a large number of countries now. Ceftriaxone resistance is low, but it's increasing, and it's threatening. The double resistance to the current WHO-recommended, CDC-recommended, European guideline-recommended guidelines is traveling around, and there will be the need very soon to revise again. and maybe introduce some level of testing for resistance as a point of care diagnosis. I'll come back to that. The true level of treatment failure, this is all microbiological points, and the true level of treatment failure is not known in many cases, but that's the warning. Dual therapy may not be working anymore. Important to watch out for extended drug-resistant gonorrhea, because the few 4 cases in Japan, Australia, and UK tell you that, yes, it's disseminated around the world now. And with travel, this is what you bring in your suitcase if you don't pack the condoms in the first place. So what's next? And that's my final slide. We need point-of-care antimicrobial resistance tests to improve treatment precision and management. And there may be the welcome comeback of ciprofloxacin, and that is really considered in the UK, that once you've abandoned a drug for many years, it actually becomes active again. So there may well be some patients, maybe half of them, that could receive ciprofloxacin, and then you can spare if you want the other regimens. There are new drugs are absolutely needed, and I am not familiar with those particular trials, but there is a trial of the macrolide families, so erythromycin, and those other trials which are in phase 2 clinical trials. I think there is a need of better prevention, carry your condoms, of course, but on the horizon, and that is going to be a really exciting area, is WHO is calling for a meeting in January, I think, of experts to resurrect the idea of developing vaccines. It's been very elusive to have a gonococcal vaccine, but interestingly, a couple of countries like New Zealand, Cuba, and Norway have found that because they've given very high level, very high coverage of meningococcal B vaccine to their population, they found there was a decreased incidence of gonorrhea without doing anything more, if you want, in terms of prevention. So it looks like it's a proof of principle that one could knock off neisserias, at least, from the genital tract. At this point, I'd like to, well, thank you very much. Muito obrigado. I'd like to thank my colleague Gwenda, and just mentioned again, she'll be talking about the surveillance as it is organized in the UK, and her colleague Michelle Cole and Helen Pfeiffer have contributed to this talk. Really sincerely thank my colleagues from the INCOBRA. It's a Brazilian-European network we have created to work on STI research and AMR, STI research in particular. Vivian is a member. Clara also with CRT and Arthur Kalishman in São Paulo, and others in Brasilia and in Rio and in Santa Catarina as well. In particular, Aloysio Segurado was my host at USP, and Silvia Costa, who has invited me. And watch out, gonorrhea is getting meaner. Thank you very much.